Well, I guess the cat's out of the bag. I'm not a designer. I never have been. I'm not a graphic designer. I'm not a type designer. And I came to the study of the history of typography as an art historian. And so I think that perhaps the best way to describe this approach that I'm bringing today would be to borrow Malou Verlum's phrase from his talk on Wednesday when he said from the outside in and not the inside out. And it's perhaps fitting then that I'm going to talk today about the work of someone who's not a type designer. In 1964, a book designer named Robert Massin sat watching an absurdist play at the Théâtre des Noctambules in Paris. Massin was familiar with this play, as it was popularly read in book form, yet that evening Massin excitedly approached the playwright and propositioned him with an odd idea: a typographic interpretation of the live play. With playwright Eugène Ionesco's blessing, Massin attended the live performance of the play La Cantatrice chauve over 20 times, recording the dialogue in preparation for rendering typographic the figures moving on stage and the dialogue exchanged between them. Now, Massin was not a typeface designer. He had worked as an editor, a journalist, and then a book designer for two French book clubs, and the Club Français du Livre and the later Club du Meilleur Livre. And these French book clubs had emerged after World War II as a kind of literary subscription service to compensate for the kind of collapse of the publishing house distribution. And it was for the book clubs that Massin designed the book covers, and he designed some really odd material book covers involving plates and strange materials. And he also learned the basics of typesetting and layout design, and he studied under Pierre Faucheux. In 1960, Massin became the first art director at Gallimard, where he worked until 1979. And it was at Gallimard that Massin had this crazy idea to typographically redesign Ionesco's play, and here it is. Originally written in 1950 as Ionesco's first play and considered a work of absurdist theater, La Cantatrice chauve presents two couples, the Smiths and the Martins, in a state of decay of communication, as they exchange banal and nonsensical conversation. Eugène Ionesco was interested in linguistic structures and barriers to meaning, and was inspired to write his play through his experience of learning English through the assimile method, in which phrases of dialogue were employed to demonstrate grammatical constructions. In his interpretation, Massin employs a different typeface for each character with a combination of serif and sans serif fonts, Romans, and italics. On his pages, words are visually suspended between writing, speaking, moving, and reading. There are different graphic signifiers of speech, the thought bubble and the enlarged distorted type, and the dialogue as typography takes center stage. Photographer Henry Cohen designed these photographics of the bodies in which he photographed the actors on this, at Gallimard, actually, in the publishing house. And as the communication breaks down between these characters in the play, the type as dialogue becomes increasingly more chaotic. The literary dialogue becomes what Richard Hollis noticed as a relentless accumulation of banality which descends into hysterical realism and tragic farce. Ionesco allowed Massin to eliminate much of the punctuation, except for the question and exclamation marks, though the stage directions retain the punctuation. To make these typographic interpretations, Massin would laboriously cut and paste fragments of text and employ phototypesetting and projection techniques to set the type on the page. Cohen eliminated the halftones in his photographisme in the characters to make them as graphic as possible to go with the dialogue. Massin used an opidiouscope to project the proofs of type onto the wall and then traced the letters on tracing paper by hand for each double-page spread before he would then combine them with the photostat image. Sometimes Massin would cut entire blocks of text and paste them, and other times he would paste an isolated letter. It was very playful, his method. Massin layered the individual photostat printed letters on top of one another to achieve the scattering of letters on the layout paper, and everything was pasted with Scotch tape to hold it together, as he then added layers of the photographics and more text. The process allowed Massin to carefully control the arrangement of letter spacing and size enlargements. The entire composition was then, of course, slated to be offset printed on coated paper. And Letraset did exist around this time, but it was supposedly too expensive. So he really worked in the dead of the night to make these compositions. It was very much a passion project for him. And 2 translations followed. Interestingly, there was an English edition and an American edition, so the Bald Prima Donna and the Bald Soprano in 1965 and 66. In the work, Massin assigns a different character, or a different typeface for each character. The dialogue of Monsieur Smith is assigned Plantin, an old-style serif based on a 16th century cut that's fairly thick, and Madame Smith is given Plantin italic. Monsieur Martin is portrayed with the monotype grotesque, and Madame Martin's dialogue appears in Gilson's italic. The monotype grotesque is a more expressive sans serif, while the Gilson's is, of course, a noticeably bold sans serif. And the fire chief is represented with monotype Clarendon, a slab serif, while the maid Marie is assigned Cheltenham Bold Roman, a late 19th century serif face intended for display. And the stage directions are in light Egyptian, italicized in very small point font on the page so as to almost disappear. And noted in almost every graphic design survey book that I've encountered as a key work that influenced the eclecticism and the freedom of designers to follow, Massin generated a sensational typographic work considered today as his masterpiece. It received a gold medal at the International Book Exhibition at Leipzig in 1965, and Karl Dare was actually a judge. And he received the book so enthusiastically, stating it represented a radical departure from the typographic conventions of the book and earned a unanimous approval of judges of diverse viewpoints, social philosophies, and cultural backgrounds. One does not really read this book, one attends a performance typographically staged by Massin. And Dare actually wrote a letter to Massin in 1966 that I found in the Massin archives in Chartres, France, where he talked about how Marshall McLuhan was especially excited about this work, which makes me wonder perhaps this was influential in McLuhan's collaboration with Quentin Fiore that happens a few years later in 67. Who knows? But contrary to the idea that Massin presented a very loyal interpretation of this play, where he's just taking the live play and making an exact typographic representation, if that could even exist, even Ionesco understood something different to have happened here. Massin created not only a typographic interpretation of a play, but a magnification of it, right? A second Cantatrice, as Ionesco said. In his own writing, Massin refers to this work not as an interpretation, but a translation. Now, Massin produced similar works during the 60s of what scholars such as Letitia Wolf term expressive typography, which is, of course, borrowing the term from Ed Gottschall that was then championed by Lubelin. And in these expressive works of typography, here we go, Massin took experimental literary works and typographically redesigned them, as we see here with Délire à deux, completed by Massin in 1966. Also a play by Ionesco, in this work, a couple argues violently and nonsensically while the sounds of war continue outside. Now, Massin subtitled this work, which was made with the use of transfer lettering, actually, as an essay in the calligraphy of sound. So in this work, large point typefaces stretch across the page as undulating forms, transposed over one another in varying sizes, punctuated by large, very disruptive splatters of ink. And in the case of this image, we have this really interesting depiction of the broken glass, which I love to think about in the context of typographic transparency and graphic transparency. Massin's experiments with types are always experiments with the language of type, I think, in which he manipulates and exaggerates these forms over and over again. Now, Massin is working during a moment where rationalist typographers like Adrian Frutiger were working to design types based on this early 20th century emphasis of the geometric sans serif, which was seen to profess nothing but clear and universal communication, of course. The grid-based rationalist sans serif was wildly popular, as we know, and it proliferated in public information signage. It was literally in the landscape, and it was in publications all over Europe, and it had become the type that embodied this post-war standardization and universalization. It was seen to lack the nationalist associations that people were trying to move away from, and it presented a visually and ideologically clear communication as an unobtrusive medium. And Frutiger's Universe typeface, it was released in 1957 for Desberny and Peignot, and one of the initial name propositions, I don't know if you know, but I find it interesting, was monde, world, as of course they were eager to describe this more universal typeface that they were creating that was in line with these burgeoning rationalist and sort of anti-nationalist sensibilities. Frutiger was concerned with legibility, communication, efficiency, and visibility in his system of this typeface. And in this complete system, it took the trends of the international style and it multiplied this promise for unification and clear communication. And this geometric sans serif was extremely successful, as we know, and it paved the way for a proliferation of these kinds of designs, an influence still seen everywhere today. Now, Massin's immediate context of this rationalist design and this geometric sans serif and what it was meant to, it purported to say about universalization in design, it can be felt in this 1963 work for Exercices de Style, now a year earlier than the one I opened with. Now, the seminal text of Potential Literature by Raymond Queneau, it retells the same story 99 times through the use of different literary variations. So for the 1963 Gallimard re-edition of Exercices de Style, Massin completed 99 typographic titles to accompany the 99 prose exercises. Massin designed titles for each by employing different typefaces, sizes, illustrations, different weights, and other orthographic peculiarities, and typographic interventions in general. Now, when I came across this work, I was particularly fascinated because I knew Queneau's work as a work of literature. I knew it as a small pocketbook, with the Dido. And the group Ulipo was a group that I knew and was interested in. And it was founded in 1960 in conjunction with, Queneau was a founding member. And they wanted to push the boundaries of literature and investigate what would happen if you subject literature to these constraints. What kind of text could you produce by controlling them through experiments and then seeing what would happen to the text itself. So Massin's intervention is quite interesting when you think about the text itself. And Massin was close with Queneau because these literary figures were walking the halls of Gallimard, of the publishing house. So it makes sense that this design collaboration came to be. I think Massin was just excited and he had so many ideas and wanted to collaborate. And so coming across this work, I was determined to figure out what the book designer was trying to do. And I think it can be found in the typographic context in France and in his own writings where he describes this context surrounding him. And I think he's reacting typographically in a way that echoes the loud absurdities of these literary works, but I think in a way that stands apart from the literary aims and the message of the text. Now, Exercices de Style is comprised of many found fonts, so Massin would photograph facsimiles of letters and cut and paste them one by one, pulling often from the catalog of Deberny and Peignot or ATF. And in this, I think the type can be seen as a kind of ready-made form in which Massin is selecting, modifying, repositioning, and remaking typography. Upon its publication in 1963, this book was received by the press as bizarre, entertaining, funny, humorous. And the press found the catalog of typographic styles, which was a list of the fonts at the back of the book that I showed on the previous slide. The press found those to be even more puzzling than the typographic titles themselves. But Massin is not in accord with this book as a work of humor. He wasn't trying to be funny. For him, it was a serious typographic endeavor where he was trying to excavate relevant historical forms and convey complex meanings and serious wordplay. And in this work, Massin parodies the universe typeface as the Exercice Analyse Logique, which is here on the left. This title appears in all capitals of Universe 57, and each letter form is isolated by the slash. The word is fractured to visually organize and separate its letters, breaking apart its clearness and transparency as communication to showcase its rigidity and its rationalized and streamlined structure. Here, the word is broken apart so that we look a bit longer at each letter. And I think in this typographic exercise and style, Massin has demonstrated that even the most rationalist type can be playfully arranged to reveal its more expressive nature. He exploits the materiality to prove that expression presides over communication, even in universe, where order and clarity is merely the expressive situation of this particular letter. Massin also parodies the rationalist type and the geometric sans serif in La Cantatrice chauve. For the page with the long anecdote, Massin employs it in such a crowded grid that the capital letters become one dense block of text. In this example, the sans serif is used against itself to directly defy the goals of pure communication. The rigid paragraph becomes almost unreadable as a dense block with loose spacing between the words, yet no letting between the lines of text so that they sit atop one another touching. It is contrarily the white space that can be read. And I can't help but think of the by fur page that we saw where it says, this is not how to use it. I think that's kind of what Massin is doing here. He's sort of using it how you're not supposed to. However, long before Massin, Frutiger and the rationalist type in France, by rationalist here I mean the geometric streamlined sans serif, I don't mean the sort of Romain Duras rationalization of type. But in the 16th century, we have Geofroy Tory. And Tory was an engraver, an orthographer, typographer, author, philologist, humanist. He was many things. He was very mysterious. And he wanted to reform the French language. So he did this by introducing orthographic changes and punctuation. And his book, The Fleury of 1529, is a typographic treatise that models the ideal Roman letter on the proportion of the human body. And this treatise is seen as quite influential, and it's in France largely turned from the Gothic to the Roman following it. So I think you can kind of pick up on this as something that's situated in that turn. And Massin states in his book Letter and Image, we have need today of a second Geofroy Tory. He's adamant, and I think he's attentive to what he finds to be Tory's significant positioning in this evolution of French typography in producing the move away from the Gothic character to the Roman letter. I think that's how he sees it. And his work, in many ways, I think, is inflected with this statement. But instead of opposing the hegemony of the Gothic in the 16th century, he opposes the mid-20th century hegemony of this rationalist type and the idea that type should and can be rationally designed. Now, while Geofroy Tory in the 16th century wanted to turn away from the standardization of the Gothic, Massin in the 1960s therefore wants to turn away from the standardization of clear communication in a way that brings us back to the layers of expressiveness that exist in theater and in daily life. For type cannot actually make a sound like the voice, nor can it move like actors on stage. Well, it can move, but you know what I mean. But it does possess these visual and material qualities that, when augmented, force us to notice the type. And Stephen Heller has commented that Massin's work for the Cantatrice chauve succeeds in its presentation of type as voice. And scholars have similarly argued that in Massin's work, typography embodies and interprets speech as a visual representation of dialogue. However, I think the closer Massin moves typography to this realm of speech, the more I think he only succeeds in problematizing it. And this is something that we've been talking about. And in Anne Bestman's talk, she reminds us about this tenuous but possible connection between the type and the voice, but ultimately typography will always lack that expressiveness of the voice. And for Massin, I think type lives in these imaginative spaces of the page where voice can only be suggested, and movement is only a visual trick, and transparency is a typographic fantasy. Massin, he watched the play, listened to the dialogue, and imagined typography in which the space of the play as the stage becomes the space of the book as the page. And his exaggerated type serves only to remind us that typography troubles the way we present language in the same ways we might veil meanings or say nothing at all with spoken words. Rather than approaching typography as a vehicle for speech, Massin's work navigates the problems of gesture, speech, and writing through typographic acts, calling upon the opacity of typography to demonstrate the opacity of language. And the continuous and heated debates over typographic transparency, invisibility, expressivity, universality, and functionality in this moment demonstrate that typography dictates discourse in many ways, and above all, it always troubles communication. By emphasizing the powerful recesses of typography, Massin redefines typography as not a tool of communication, but its own material discourse of things. Massin's work is interconnected with contemporary philosophical debates about language and writing, typographic histories, the threat of postwar standardization, and the new technological effects on materiality that would soon change the fabric of this typographic production. On the eve of these changes, Massin's work, which incorporates cutting and pasting, manual distortions, and the use of light and film in the face of the impending dematerialization of type and type's body, his work serves to bring the type's materiality to bear and into our space of looking, considering, and inhabiting. It does so in a way that proves typography's body will never actually be dematerialized, a timely claim given the closely following development of digital technologies for typography. Massin's interpretive typography of the 1960s was presented on many occasions to his peers at the annual Rencontre de Lourdes, a meeting of typographers in the southwest of France. Yet for the greater professional public, his work was merely a playful blip on the radar of serious typographic endeavors, always bound to the space of literature and the book, which was seen to justify this more eccentric and funny typographic approach to literary meaning. However, his work was as serious about typography as it was fond. His playful subversions always indicate a larger seriousness, a larger contention with standardization, and a larger cry for us to take note of the way typography converses in and of itself. Because Massin was not a designer, his work becomes more available to us as a theoretical terrain. How did he understand type design and type form as something that mediates history, nonverbal claims, and the theatricality of life? His work transgresses a broad scope of time from the early modern to near postmodern. And with regard to today's information agenda, in which the streamlining of communication is more coveted than ever before, it is good to be reminded that typography is playfully insubordinate, as it should be. The sleek, non-ornamented type is functional, but it can also be a fantasy. Massin was thinking about type as an acting agent of language in a way that no one in the moment seemed to notice. He was not seeking the play of Dada or the expressionism of art. He was thinking about type in imagined space, type in actual space. Type as a form that carries not the voice nor gesture, but something else that is very material. We use beautiful, robust, boisterous, talkative types today to try and create something that can compete for attention in our saturated landscapes. But Massin was employing type raucously, not only to grab our attention, but to show us what type can actually do in this world. I think it is this influence that is ultimately the most influential. Like ATypI, Massin's work holds a mirror to history and reflects upon the tradition of typography in France, but it dares to be different. His work is relevant today when we embrace the more eccentric approaches to typography and the uses of it, as it reminds us to revisit the materiality of type as something that lives in its own realm of life between speech and reading. For, as we know in this room, typography really is how we interact with life itself, isn't it? Thank you.